Hello, everybody. Welcome to CripChat, your weekly podcast for everything disability. Today, I have with me Jonathan Shar, Ibby D, and myself, David D. Today, we have a guest with us, Graeme Innes.
Thank you very much, David. And welcome everyone to CripChat, your weekly podcast on everything disability. Today we have a very special guest, Graeme Innes. Good on you. Hello, Graeme. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you for joining us on the show. Just before we get started, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I'm now a company director. I sit on a number of national and state government boards. I used to be the Disability Discrimination Commissioner with the Human Rights Commission. I did that job for about 9 years. That was about almost 9 years ago now. So in that role, I was involved with all sorts of areas such as transport standards, access to buildings. Before that, I've been an advocate for most of my life. I was actually chair of the Disability Advisory Council back in 1992 when the Disability Discrimination Act was developed and passed by Parliament. I'm also a lawyer and I had some involvement in drafting that legislation. Also, while I was Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission, I was involved in participating in the development of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is a United Nations document, and we did that work at the UN headquarters in New York between about 2005 and 2009. So I think that's me.
Wow, so much you've done in your time. In terms of early advocacy work, you have a long history of advocacy for human rights and disability rights. Can you take us back to the early days of your advocacy work? And what inspired you to become a passionate advocate for those causes?
My first advocacy was back when I was a university student studying law. So back in the 1970s, I was involved in a group lobbying Vision Australia to provide support for getting access to textbooks in Braille and in audio. At that stage, it was on cassettes. I recognised as a student and as a member of Blind Citizens Australia, which is the advocacy organisation of people who are blind or vision impaired, I recognised the power or the strength of operating as a group rather than trying to achieve things individually. And so I got together with a number of other students who also had the challenge of getting access to material, and we successfully lobbied Vision Australia to change their processes so that the textbooks could be made available in a more sort of timely manner. That was really the first piece of advocacy that I was involved with.
Interesting. In terms of your role as Disability Discrimination Commissioner, you served as Australia's Disability Discrimination Commissioner from 2005 to 2014. Can you share some key experiences and accomplishments during your tenure in this role? Stories or moments that stand out to you?
Well, I guess I was always keen to be involved in this role since I'd been helped to develop the Disability Discrimination Act 10 or 12 years beforehand. And so I was very excited when I was appointed to the role in 2005. I knew a few things. I knew that I would need to work with the disability sector, with the community, if we were going to achieve change. And I'd learned that change usually comes far more slowly than you'd like it to, but you can achieve it if you keep working in it. And there are some real opportunities or windows that sometimes arrive, and you need to be opportunistic and take those opportunities and use those things to achieve the change that you want. Whilst I was Commissioner, the team at the Human Rights Commission were involved in working with government on the development of the DDA transport standards and the access to premises standards. They have made huge changes in Australian transport and buildings. It's not perfectly accessible, but it's way, way more accessible than it was back in 2002 when that standard was first passed. When I was involved in the passage of that standard, I was actually the Deputy Commissioner. I wasn't the Commissioner then, but did a lot of work on that standard. The result of that standard has been billions of dollars of infrastructure change so that much of our public transport systems are now far more accessible. Also, much of our buildings are far more accessible as the standards require that new buildings or existing buildings where there are major changes being made to the building have to comply with the access to premises standards. I knew that one of the things that really needed to happen in Australia if people with disabilities were to be included in all areas of society, such as jobs and participation in society, was that we needed to be able to get access to things, to transport, to buildings and all that sort of thing. So they were the building blocks, and we were able to use the Disability Discrimination Act. We were able to take a number of complaints that were made under the Act and utilise them as incentives for government and industry to change the way that they operated so that we got much better access than we had.
Good job you're doing in the community, Graeme. Give up the good work. In terms of championing equal rights, you've led public inquiries on topics like same-sex entitlements and played a pivotal role in making buildings and public transport accessible for people with disability. Will you be able to share a story with us?
Well, I was also Human Rights Commissioner for a time, and that's why I ran the same-sex, same entitlements inquiry. And that was soon after I joined the Commission, and that was a no-brainer, really, because people were treated differently simply because of who they loved. That just seemed completely unfair to me. And so we ran a public inquiry. We got people to tell their stories. We conducted hearings around the country. We made a whole bunch of recommendations that government should change over 100 laws which related to people of same-sex orientation. These covered things like tax law, child support law, other areas of federal law. And all of those law changes were enacted by the government at the time. So in that sense, that was a great success. And, you know, the reason that happened was because of the strength of lobbying of the same-sex community behind those recommendations and taking a unified position on those recommendations. One of the decisions that we made as part of that inquiry was that we didn't make a recommendation about same-sex marriage. And that was largely my decision. I made a judgment call that if we put same-sex marriage into the recommendations, then we wouldn't be able to maintain the support that we had for the inquiry. And I've always worked on the basis that 70% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And so we took that strategic decision. Some in the same-sex lobbies were pretty disappointed with that decision. It probably, given the angst and arguments that occurred when the same-sex marriage plebiscite took place maybe 10 or 12 years later, it probably was the right decision. It suggests to me that, you know, we wouldn't have got through the things that we did back in 2007, I think, if we tried to include same-sex marriage. That's one of the stories of being in a public role like that and running an inquiry like that. You have to make judgment calls. I think we got that call right, but I'm not claiming that I got all the calls, judgment calls that I've made over the years right. Sometimes you don't, but that's part of the process of being in the role such that I was in.
Yeah, it's all about recognizing human rights. It's very important. In terms of inspiring change, advocacy often involves confronting challenges. Can you share a particular challenge you faced during your advocacy journey and how you successfully navigated it? What did you learn from this experience?
Probably the biggest challenge I faced in my advocacy journey was when I lodged a disability discrimination complaint against Sydney Trains. I used to travel to and from work by train when everyone who could see could look at the screens on the platforms or in the trains or the signage on the stations and see where they were. I couldn't do that. And what I sought was to know where I was, and I sought that through audible announcements on trains. These had been promised by state governments since the 1980s, before the Disability Discrimination Act was enacted, and they were actually a requirement in the first 5 years of the DDA transport standards. So governments were required in the standards to make those announcements available by December 2007. That hadn't happened in New South Wales trains. And so I went to the state minister and said, look, this is a standard. The requirement is that you're supposed to make these announcements. They're not being made. Every time I catch a train where there's no announcement, I'm going to lodge a DDA complaint. And I actually ended up lodging about 50 complaints, 30 of which went to the federal court because the department wouldn't resolve them by conciliation, which is the process that you can use under the Disability Discrimination Act. And there was a finding made in my favour, which meant that Sydney Trains would need to make these announcements available. And those announcements are now made on trains. The challenge for me was that for the first time, I wasn't doing this as Commissioner. I was doing this as Graeme who, used to travel to work by train each day, doing it as an individual, because that's the way the DDA works at the moment. And that's probably a problem with the DDA, but, that's a topic for another conversation. So I had to go to court. My wife and I, we knew that our house was at risk if we lost, because it was possible for costs to be awarded against us in the federal court. We took the decision that this was an important matter of principle. But that was a pretty challenging process for me to go through, and I think the way I got through it was just the support of the individuals around me, both people who were blind, who supported my initiative, and also just people who generally supported the success of human rights causes like that and kept telling me how valuable what I was doing was. But that was a pretty scary process for quite a while.
How important was those social support in those times?
Sorry, Jonathan, how important was
the social supports in those times?
Oh, very important. Very important, and that's what I say. The support of my wife and my family, the support of other people with disabilities who saw what I was trying to do and supported me for doing it, and the support of friends and supporters, much of which I heard about through social media. I was very much on Twitter at that time before Elon Musk destroyed it. So that was critical to my success, to keep me focused and to keep me determined to keep pushing forward.
Thank you very much for that, sharing that story, Graeme. Inspecting Australia's immigration detention centre is significant work. Could you elaborate on this experience and share insights into how it relates to human rights and equality?
The inspection of immigration detention centres were part of my role as Human Rights Commissioner, and I did those inspections around the country. And that was an important part of our obligations under both the Human Rights Act, the Refugees Convention, and the Convention Against Torture and Ill Treatment. They're all United Nations documents, and part of my function as the Human Rights Commission was to inspect those detention centres and report to government about the conditions in them and how people were treated and whether the laws were appropriate. So I had a couple of years in that role inspecting those centres, and it was pretty tough work, meeting with a whole lot of people who had come here seeking asylum, who had made the really difficult decision to leave their own country because, they felt that they were no longer safe in their own country, and who'd come to ours. And instead of us welcoming them as guests and as potential citizens, as we did with a whole lot of people from overseas in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we locked them up in immigration detention, which seemed a pretty bizarre way to approach the situation. So my job was to go around and meet with these people, talk to them, visit the centres, and then make recommendations to government as to, what changes should be made.
Throughout your career, you received several honours degrees. What emotions did you experience when you were honoured with these degrees? And what do they mean to you?
Well, they mean a heck of a lot. Recognition by your peers and by academic society and academic bodies such as universities means a heck of a lot to me. I was honoured to become a member of the Order of Australia when I worked on the Disability Discrimination Act back in the 90s, and then to receive degrees from 4 different universities, honorary doctorates, when I finished my work as Human Rights Commission. They meant a lot to me, and I was very humbled that people thought that my work was of such value that I would receive those awards. But, the important thing for me was making change, which meant that people with disabilities were more included in Australia. So it wasn't about me, it was about changing our society to be far more welcoming of people with disabilities and to give us a chance, that is, people with disabilities, a chance to live our lives as part of society, not as a separate group to live our lives not separated in sheltered workshops or in segregated schools or in segregated accommodation, but to be able to live in the community, to be able to work in the community, to be able to participate in the community and to contribute in the community through the payment of taxes. Because that's what most of us really want to do, but we can't do it unless the community includes us and welcomes us in. I gave a National Press Club address when I finished my work at the Human Rights Commission, and I used a phrase which I've used a lot over the years, which is a reference to the soft bigotry of low expectations. What I mean by that is that society demonstrates its soft bigotry by making very negative and limiting assumptions about what we as people with disability will be able to do, or more to the point, won't be able to do. And I'm sure all of you have run into this whenever you interact in society. When you get into a taxi or a bus or a train, or when you're on your way to work or to some sort of community activity, or when you're trying to get a job and can't get a job, and people make assumptions about you that assume you won't be able to do a whole lot of things that you know you can, and that if they gave you just the slightest chance, you would demonstrate you could. And that's what I mean by the soft bigotry of low expectations. And Australians with disability still experience it. Every time I go out in public, I have people who talk to the person I'm with rather than talking to me. I have people who want to treat me differently because I can't see, and they make a whole lot of other assumptions about what I won't be able to do. I have people in airport security processes who refuse to let me go through the standard security process because I travel with a guide dog, and want me to go through some separate and far more invasive, far more intrusive process. Yeah, everywhere I go. I couldn't tell you the number of times where I've paid a bill and the change has been given to my wife or my daughter or whoever I'm with, because why would we give it to him he can't see? Just little things like that which demonstrate a very negative and limiting attitude towards people with disabilities. And until we solve that problem, we won't solve the problem of inclusion of people with disabilities, and we won't be allowed by the community to live our lives to the fullest extent possible.
Ensuring accessibility for people with disabilities is crucial. Can you describe a story or project where you were part of making buildings and public transport more accessible?
Well, the access to premises standards and the access to transport standards, and they were really laws which made buildings far more accessible. Every time I go to the Brisbane Convention Centre, I live up near Brisbane now in northern New South Wales in Tweed Heads, and every time I go to the Brisbane Convention Centre, I catch the lift. There's a glass-sided lift out the front of the centre, right next to the sweeping set of stairs that most people enter the centre. And that lift is there because a guy called Kevin Cox, who later became the Queensland Disability Discrimination Commissioner, thought it was unfair that because he used a wheelchair, he would have to go into the centre through a different entrance, not the front entrance, but some back entrance. And he felt that sent a real signal that people with disabilities weren't welcome in what was Queensland's centre of entertainment and art and activity. And so he lodged a complaint, and I certainly, supported him in the lodging of that complaint. And the Queensland government was forced to install the glass-sided lift that I've talked about that goes up right next to this sweeping flight of stairs, so that we as people with disabilities can enter that centre in the same place as everyone else does. That's a really meaningful symbol for me of what access to premises means, that we can go in the front door along with everyone else.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Graeme, your advocacy has covered various aspects of human rights. How do you perceive the intersectionality of different human rights issues? And what can advocates do to address them comprehensively?
I suppose, you start from a point that we're all humans and that a whole lot of issues of disempowerment are part of the human condition. It might be disability, it might be Aboriginality, it might be that we come from a different cultural or linguistic background. And these things aren't just separated off in separate boxes. If I'm a First Nations person and have a disability, then those are two areas of disadvantage that I carry, and they intersect, they cross with each other. So we see that the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are in prison is way, way higher than white Australians. And many of those people who are in prison are Aboriginal people with disabilities. So that's a practical example of intersectionality. And it's really important for advocates to recognise that we're all humans, we all bring our life experience and our disadvantage to the table. And so you can't separate those things out. They can have an impact which is greater than the sum of the two intersecting areas. So that's really what intersectionality means.
Interesting. What advice would you give to individuals who aspire to follow in your footsteps and become advocates for human rights and disability rights? Are there personal experiences that have shaped your appearance?
It's always hard to advise other people who are going to carry out advocacy. You have to be committed and passionate about what you're doing. You have to recognise that the journey is a long journey of small steps. You don't often get the big wins. You get little incremental changes. And it's really important to celebrate those changes when they come and recognise the impact that they have. It's also really important to work together as a group of people with disabilities. I would never go into an advocacy situation on my own. If it was me that was advocating, I would always take someone with me, and I've always been happy to go with people who are as their support person when they've been advocating in a particular situation. It's really important to have that personal support and encouragement right next to you and someone else to be able to talk through the challenges and the best way forward. As I said, recognise that it's a long journey with small steps, and it will always be much slower than you want it to be, because if you're advocating for change and an increase in the availability of human rights, that change will always go more slowly than you want it to. We as change agents, that's something that we need to recognise, not accept, but understand, so that we can keep on going with that journey. So those are the sorts of things, I think, that are important to recognise as an advocate and to keep progressing with.
Awesome. A great leader you are in your community. And speaking of our future, goals, looking ahead, what are some of your goals and aspirations as an advocate and a chancellor? What stories do you hope to create or influence in the future in these roles?
Oh, well, I want to continue the change journey that I've been on for most of my life. I want to achieve all the things that I've talked about in terms of that attitude change. I think that's a key thing. And I want to make sure that more people with disabilities are employed. We're employed at a rate 30% lower than the general population. And that hasn't changed in 4 or 5 decades. So we need to address that. So I want to be involved in that. And I want to keep ensuring that people with disabilities have moved much more to the centre of the conversation in the last 10 or 15 years. I want to try and make sure that that keeps happening. So I'm very happy to make a contribution to that. But I'm very excited because 10 or 20 years ago, sometimes it used to feel to me that I was the only voice or public figure lobbying for these changes. That is not the case now. So many people are stepping up. People with disabilities are putting themselves forward and being put forward by their allies and supporters to speak on behalf of us and to carry those journeys on that I've talked about. I'm coming towards, in broad terms, towards the end of my work in this area now. I mean, I'm a lot closer to the end than to the beginning, but I'm very confident that there are people there with me and behind me who will carry on the work.
Yeah, a great leader you are in this space. So continue to advocate, and I'm more than happy to follow your footsteps. You're doing such amazing work, Graeme, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us on the show today.
It's a pleasure. It's always great to talk with people such as yourselves and share some of the lessons I've learned and hopefully pass them on so that, you don't need to have to go back and repeat them. You can learn from those and build on the foundations that I and many, many others have been involved with laying.
Thank you, Graeme, for coming on the show. And we hope to elevate the disability discourse.
Thanks, Jonathan. No, it's been great to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. You've been watching CripChat, your weekly podcast on everything disability. Goodbye for now.